Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 10th of April, and in today's video, we're looking at a wide variety of updates from the front line over the past 48 hours, with the main topic of discussion being the Russian breakthrough along the Toretsk front, a 6 kilometer advance into the Ukrainian rear. And we're going to look at the video that was posted by the Ukrainian side and a couple of other significant updates, including a rather deep penetration into the Kursk region. But we will begin by zooming in on Rozdolnya, which is in Donetsk. So you can see over here the Russian forces, they captured territory amounting to 2.5 square kilometers just north of said village. Rozdolnya has been an area that the Russians have used as a forward troop buildup location for a very long time. And for a while, there were actually Ukrainian forces harassing the rear either through ground forces or through just incessant artillery or drone strikes. But over the past couple of months, the intensity of Ukrainian assaults on this town have reduced gradually, given a lot of pressure being directed towards areas like Kurakove and Andrivka, and now the line between Oleksivka and Bakhatir. So all of the fighting southwards in Rozdolnya has sort of taken a back seat. But this has also given the Russians at this point in time, as of today and yesterday, the opportunity to begin expanding their horizon, because this area north of Rozdolnya is not necessarily the most well fortified, although there are two lines of anti-tank ditches, and I would also presume there are dragon's teeth along these locations. That's not necessarily going to stop Russian infantry from advancing and crossing over those obstacles, because there aren't actually Ukrainian soldiers manning the entire line. That would be impossible both in terms of the feasibility of sending in troops into the open in an area that is rather exposed and not necessarily connected to any town that has basements in them, because the nearest town to these two lines would be Odradnya and into the west Khmar. And those areas are also pretty close to the front line and are dangerous to settle in with a large group of forces in their own rights, let alone sending in a large contingent to hold on to a really wide trench line out in the open in an area that is rather disconnected from many other Ukrainian nodes of defense. So, really, this location does consist of obstacles for vehicles. And so, it could be more difficult for Russian armored assaults to occur in this location, but they haven't for the most part. We've just seen infantry based advances. And that's what we saw over the past couple of days with this advance recorded by the Russian side. And so, now we will be keeping an eye out for whether this was just a positional advance or whether the Russians are actually able to seize this opportunity and continue taking control over open fields in areas that really are opportune, because you do see there's also this road over here. So there is a path for Russian soldiers on foot to advance sort of parallel to the road along some of the windbreaks over here, and then to assault Bakhatir from the southern direction. So there could be a potential flanking maneuver based on this new advance, and it would couple with the movement that we've seen in Rosliv that I'll get to in a moment. And also, Odradny would be more isolated, and the Russians would close in on it as a result. And more generally, you could see the Russians begin to siphon off some of these higher elevated locations east of Komar, both in order to flank Komar itself, because obviously taking over the ridges that overlook Komar in the entire river valley is good from a topographic standpoint and just from a positional standpoint, because then you have control over the eastern flank. But it also would give the Russians the power and projection to overlook the entire line of Ukrainian villages on the rear, all the way up northwards to the border between Donetsk and Dnipro. So there are a lot of sort of midterm considerations for this movement that would sort of start off with the genesis being north of Rozdolnya. And it doesn't really necessarily have to come from Rozdolnya itself. It could come directly from the east as well. But eventually, the Russians will be looking to get control over this area that I've marked with this sort of cylinder shape, because of the higher elevation points and the way in which it dominates the adjacent river valleys. And so just keep an eye for that in the coming months, because I believe this will be prescient. But to zoom in on Rosliv, now Deep State has admitted that the entirety of the village is under Russian control, but this has been the case for a while, and I've sort of moved on because it hasn't really been a topic of relevance for like a couple of weeks now. We've all known and it's been established that the Russians are fully in control of this location, but actually Deep State's updates, they showed that there was a gray zone that extended further northwestwards all the way to this location over here, I believe, the gas station. And so that would indicate that perhaps there was Russian movement, Russian armored assault or infantry-based assault, I'm not exactly sure, that pushed out of Rosliv and was able to reach the highway that then leads to the southern flank of Bakhatir. And so, based on that, Deep State may have changed their mapping to indicate that gray zone. Now, I don't know if that's true because there isn't any reporting on it yet, and we haven't seen any footage, but just keep an ad for a potential Russian sort of blossoming outside of Roslev. And just besides that fact, the area south of Roslev is almost certainly not under Ukrainian control at this point because it's been a while. This area does not really have or consist of any fortifications. It's a couple of tree lines, and the Russians have had a lot of time to stabilize and consolidate control over their forward positions in Roslev. And so holding on to this outstretched salient is really difficult given all those circumstances and given the fact that most of the Ukrainian attention is focused on holding on to this solid vertical line between Oleksivka and Bakhatir. So I might change my map just out of understanding of those circumstances. Now, moving northwards over here, you can see that the Russian forces have been able to capture what amounts to nearly 2 square kilometers of territory. So this is from April 9th. This is the Hydra drone unit, which is associated with the 35th Marine Brigade. So they spotted a Russian column, either 6 or 7 vehicles. I can't remember correctly, but the video link is over here. One MTLB at least was destroyed during that assault because it was filmed on camera, so we could see the artillery shell targeting the MTLB and the destruction and the fire engulfing the vehicle. And based on that geolocation, we know that the column came from the eastern direction, advanced along this area parallel to the tree line, and made it to a location just south of Bodanivka. And Bodanivka itself, we don't have proof yet that the entirety of the hamlet is under Russian control. We know that there were assaults, numerous assaults. It was like 2 weeks ago now, that were at the eastern entrance, but actually entering into the houses, we haven't seen any indication of that yet. So I'm keeping it as a gray zone. Now it seems the Russians have expanded their horizons a bit to the south, and they're looking to overrun this line over here, this line of anti-tank ditches, and maybe there are also some trenches nearby. So this is one of the only fortified lines that the Ukrainians have nearby. And after that point, you have just a large exposed section of the front line in between the aforementioned line over here that I'm just going to mark in red, and then the Vavcha River Valley over here. So everything in between is sort of sandwiched in an area that is very exposed, albeit not on low elevation. It is on rather high elevation, which is why the Russians would, of course, be keen on seizing it for themselves. It would give them opportune positions to overlook the Ukrainian populated areas that we've discussed earlier on in the video. And also, there's the opportunity to flank the current Ukrainian frontline garrison that you see marked over here with this salient over here, because it is a bit exposed in terms of just its natural positioning. And this area does include some units like 35th Brigade, and you could click on the unit icons to see as well. You have 153rd Brigade, maybe even elements of the 72nd are operating a bit to the south over here. So the Russians are trying to expand their routes of attack in order to break through this current front line, and then not only focus on the southern axis, but also perhaps gain some leverage to then attack from the south towards Toretsk and Horikove. Because right now the Ukrainians from the Consolidated Rifle Brigade of the Air Force and 72nd Brigade are maintaining cohesiveness along the line of contact over here and prevented infiltrations into the final 2 villages before arriving at the border with Dnipro, which is extremely critical for the Ukrainians to prevent. At the same time, though, the Russians have been able to advance deeper into Nadivka. You can see that over here with an advance amounting to 0.6 square kilometers. And right now, the Ukrainians only remain in the western warehouses and in some trenches that are on the northern outskirts. And besides that, it's really just an open area that the Ukrainians have as a buffer before you would arrive from a Russian perspective at the border with Dnipro and the Solona River Valley. So there is an issue here because now Uspanivka has largely been taken over by the Russian side, which acted as a pin down point. The Russians that were fighting along the river valley in Solona, they were pinned down and couldn't really focus on any other locations that are adjacent to it because they were so embroiled in the fighting in Uspanivka. But now that they've captured it, they could begin expanding their horizons, as I said, further westwards towards other villages nearby, like Novoserhivka. And this could be coupled with a Russian advance from the south, east, southwest, towards areas like Novomykolaivka. But it's all dependent on the Russian commitment to assaults over here and whether they're actually consistent with the gains or whether it is just a attack of circumstance and there aren't really orders or a will to do more than that, depending on the amount of vehicles allocated to such an assault, because you would be looking at a Russian infiltration of like 6 kilometers, which is rather deep. and then also the troops necessary to do so. So I really don't know if that's going to be feasible in an area like Nadivka, where I haven't seen that much commitment to resources for the Russian garrison over there. But we'll have to wait and see. In Kotlina, Russian forces are fighting, and basically my front line of the situation is going to remain the same. But Ukrainians have released videos of their forces, I believe, from the 3rd National Guard Brigade Spartan, clearing out houses that are located around here. So I may change my map to indicate that the Ukrainians are present over here. But in terms of where the Russians are located, there are a couple of geolocated videos of drone strikes, and they're basically right on the perimeter of my front line location for where the Russians are. So there's nothing necessarily inaccurate. The front line over here, I believe, based on the videos that I've seen, and the just consensus is that nothing has really changed to a significant degree. Additionally, we know that to the east around Lysivka, this is really interesting. The Russian forces have been able to take over the largest extent of the village to date, and we've been looking at Lysivka for an ungodly amount of time by now, since October 3rd of 2024. It's been so long, since it's been half a year of just fighting. And now, after those 6 months, the Russians have been able to advance not even 4 kilometers westwards in the horizontal direction. So you can see on April 10th, the 25th Brigade, they shelled Russian soldiers in these houses in the western parts of the village, indicating that nearly all of it is under their control. Now, moving forward, there is a question about whether the Ukrainians remain in the Chenska, because they did conduct an infiltration operation and were able to reach the eastern portions of the village, which creates a bit of a salient now because of the Russian advances recently. And so, if they're still here, then they could be squeezed out, and then the front line would sort of get stabilized along the sort of trenches built by the Ukrainians to defend the outer perimeter, the outer suburbs of Pokrovsk. So this is a part of just Russian shaping operations to, begin pushing forward past this current line that the Ukrainians have been able to hold on to more generally for the past 6 months, or even more in certain cases. Looking at the situation in between, I would say, the Pokrovsk and Toretsk fronts, this is really interesting. So we haven't seen these sort of advances by the Russian side directly north of Chertine for a very long time. Arkhangelsk was one of the final examples, but over here you can see that within the span of a couple of days, the Russian forces, and the garrison over here is rather small, they're able to advance 4 square kilometers. So this includes taking over areas that are pretty rugged in terrain, a couple of ponds, trenches, houses that are rather isolated. But the actual, I suppose, lines, then the areas that are the most well built, have still not been entered by the Russian side. The Russians have to clear those out. And although the Ukrainian force disposition in this area is rather small, the ones that are operating over here, they are staunch, they are steadfast when it comes to defending whatever forward positions they maintained for a while, and they are well versed in the geography over here, as they've been situated in the same location for like a year by now. And so it's going to be a difficult process to clear those out individually, especially because an area like Kalinova isn't necessarily flanked. It's not enveloped on all sides. On a larger scale, it sort of is because of the flanks from the west to the east, but not enough to make a substantive difference. The problem for Kalinova is that it is a bit disconnected from the rest of the Ukrainian front line over here. And not just Kalinova, but more so the entire chain of villages that are nearby in this entire grouping of towns. Look at this area. This is a populated region. The Ukrainians have been trying to build up in terms of trenches and in terms of just defensive structure. And it is so disconnected from both the areas around Pokrovsk that are they sort of simmer away over here, and then the Toretsk region over here. And then the outlet by which they're able to receive supplies is from the north, from an area like Kostantinivka, which would be over here, just the northern end of the screen. So, in order to arrive at those areas, you have to advance along these sort of roads or perhaps through open fields. And it's a really long journey, and it's an area that is definitely exposed to Russian shelling. And so the road system is not conducive for holding out over here. The reason why it has held out is because of the local garrisons themselves, from the Ukrainian perspective, putting up a staunch resistance, and also the Russians just not really putting in much of an emphasis into attacking. But now that they have, they've been able to make notable gains, and they're very close to actually entering into Kalinova itself. So definitely keep an eye out for developments over there. But I do want to discuss in particular the developments around Toretsk. First of all, in the Zabalka district, we have another video This one is from April 9th. So the Ukrainians from the Wild Hornets drone units, previously they were around Kursk, but it appears they're now deployed over here. They struck Russian soldiers on the western slope of the Dzerzhinsky waste heap. And this is, of course, in the western location of Zabalka district. Previously, I had this area marked as under Russian control, so I'm not going to say that the entirety of Zabalka in this final salient of houses is under Russian control because we just don't have the visual proof to back it up. But let's say they are still over here. They're in an extremely exposed position because now we know the Russians are already present on foot and taking over trenches that are built along the waste heap, meaning they have a perfect line of sight to overlook the remaining Ukrainian vestiges along this western part of Zabalka that are located at an extremely low elevation in comparison. So their withdrawal westwards is going to be very complicated and will have to be done basically individually and at night. And even then, there definitely will be casualties if it's true that the Ukrainians remain over here, which is an open question because we don't know. We haven't really gotten an indication either in an affirmative or a negative perspective. Now, when it comes to the advance I was discussing at the beginning of the video, the Russians have been trying to break through northwest of Toretsk for a while, and I've been documenting this. And I did warn, actually, in my last video, I believe, of the possibility that the Russians would continue advancing along some of these paved roads and cut off the highway, not the highway, the rail line that spans from the south to the north and then eventually crosses into Konstantinivka, and more generally, the line of villages that runs along the Toretsk River because that area is very susceptible to Russian armored assaults. So now I was not expecting the Russians to take this sort of direction and then advance northwards all the way to an area like Nelipivka. I was expecting something much more local in advance of perhaps a kilometer or two. And you can see that over here that the Russians are only about 900 meters away from a choke point that would cut off the rear in Konstantinivka from the current Ukrainian frontline positions in Novospassky and Chercherbinivka. But in their most recent assault, the Russians, and they did not use that many vehicles, but they devoted their resources to attacking as far north as they could. And this is something that's really interesting. So the Russians started off in this location over here, which is pretty close to a local waste heap. They advanced along this highway over here that branches out of Toretsk, and they just kept course over there. At least two armored personnel carriers were destroyed in the footage that I saw, and the Ukrainians also claimed that they destroyed two armored personnel carriers. So that makes me believe that the video itself is not a Ukrainian mistake and that they're not filming their own vehicle get destroyed in Nelipivka, but rather they destroyed a Russian vehicle and they even admitted to that fact, which means that this actually is a geolocation of the Russian side infiltrating 6 kilometers past the front line in a single assault in really fast fashion. So you can see over here that the advance, as I was relaying to you guys, basically is 6 kilometers because this is where the assault started. And this is how we know now that the Russians have dominance over large chunks of this highway. And if you look at where this highway extends towards, let's measure it from the furthest north contact point that the Russians were able to reach. It's only about 5.6 kilometers away from the southern end of Konstantinivka. So it is approaching that point where the Russians are, beginning to put some sort of pressure onto the southern flank of that city. But they have so far not been able to consolidate these gains. And it's just a single armored assault with at least two APCs. Maybe there were a couple more that accompanied them. And the one that was able to reach this far north and reach an area like in Lipivka, it got destroyed by the Ukrainian side. With that being said, it does indicate, if you're just going to measure the highway, that the Russians captured 1.3 square kilometers of territory. But the situation is too fluid to indicate that the Russians have actually been able to establish permanent positions in Lipivka. In all likelihood, they haven't. But what this does mean is that the situation is fluid, and thereby the Ukrainians actually lack the wherewithal and the capability to maintain a solid line of contact in an area like this. For instance, I'll just give an example along this crescent over here, because if the Ukrainians were able to just seal the lid along an area that is not necessarily that wide, just this sort of 1.5 kilometer area where it's and there are a lot of avenues for deep Russian penetrations, the fact they're not even able to do that indicates that their front line over here is extremely compromised and that the Russians can continue to do these sort of advances. Obviously, at first, as with every single armored advance by the Russians, every single foray into unknown territory, they will be targeted. They will be spotted by reconnaissance crews and targeted and fixed with artillery strikes. And that will lead to significant damage to whatever column is assaulting. But eventually, it reaches a critical mass, and there is an overwhelming factor. And then there are permanent changes to the front line. So we've not reached that point yet. But what this does mean is that there is a large salient that I would consider a gray zone right now. And it would be the area that's sandwiched in between the Kryvyi Toretsk River and the rail line. And to the east, you do have this region that probably is more solid in terms of Ukrainian control, because there are a couple of trenches, there are a couple of quarries, and then a bit to the southeast, you have Dakhnia and a couple of dachas and just forested regions and houses. So that's how you have sort of the eastern edge of the Ukrainian line, areas where you do have Ukrainian forces deployed. But in the hinterlands, in this area in between that largely is open, but also has a couple of roads, this is an area that the Russians have been able to take advantage of and thereby penetrate deep into the Ukrainian rear, penetrate into one of these villages that runs along the river, and then from there you could use it to access the southern flank of Konstantinivka, which at the end of the day is the Russian objective, with their operations expanding past Toretsk. And so it is a huge deal the Russians were able to do this during their first foray, even if they have not been able to solidify control. So here I'll just click on the icon. Ukrainian drones destroyed 2 Russian APCs. One of them was a ZSTS Akhmat, which is just a wheeled APC that the Russians use a lot. And I believe it was destroyed near the beginning of the assault. But then another vehicle was able to make it northwards. I don't know which kind it was, but it was destroyed near Lipivka. These areas have previously not experienced this sort of ground combat. And in terms of size, they're rather small. So if there were ever a solid Russian base for an assault and dismounting operations, it would be hard for the Ukrainians to defend tooth and nail, because the surface area for these villages is so small. And it's much smaller than, for instance, an area like Shochurbanivka or Novospassky. These are much more, I suppose, large in terms of just raw size, but then also in terms of the amount of houses and their flanks and the basements that they have. So all things considered, it really is an interesting advance and does speak to the degradation of Ukraine's frontline cohesiveness along this particular part of the front line. So definitely something to keep an eye out for in the coming weeks, to see if there is some sort of elaboration and building upon that assault. Over here on the Luhansk front, I want to focus on this because we also have some key developments here. So the Russians advanced nearly 3 square kilometers east of Yampolivka. There was a Ukrainian outstretched salient that for a very long time was acting as a thorn in Russia's back and preventing them from advancing deeper. Now, based on this geolocation from the Vidar units, it's a drone unit of the 60th Brigade, they dropped grenades onto Russian soldiers during the nighttime that were located in some of these dugouts and in forested locations. So this is an indication that the Ukrainian side are no longer present within this forested patch, and that the Russians have been able to create a new front line that is less fluid and gives them an opportunity to then advance towards Zarichne and Torske, those being the two final villages on the eastern bank of the Zherebets River. And they are large in size. It will be difficult to run them over, but now there's an actual mechanism by which the Russians can reach them. And this is coming at the same time that the Russians are significantly expanding west of the river and have now really caused this bridgehead to become sort of a blossoming point. And so let's look at some of the recent advances as were noted by Deep State. A lot of the areas in between certain Russian vectors have now been connected and solidified by the Russian side, because there's just a lack of Ukrainian ability to hold on to large swaths of territory that don't have in them, that don't include fixed trenches, fixed positions that are well known, or some sort of village, hamlet, anything of the sort. So then all of the villages, not all of the fields, rather, in the hinterlands, they're rather easy for the Russians to take over. So this is just one example of that. 11 square kilometers of territory in between Donetsk and Luhansk being taken over by the Russian side without that much resistance. And then in terms of a maximum advance, it's about 3.2 kilometers. Now the Russians are only, 1 kilometer away from Novomikhailivka, and they have a solid base to do so. It's not just attacking from a single vector from Kateranivka. The eastern flank is also now secure as a result. And then to the south, you also have the southern flank captured, 4.7 square kilometers. And now you have the solid line for Russia to begin assaulting towards an area like Nove, which is a populated area that the Ukrainians have fallen back to. They're hoping to use the trenches as a layer of defense. But the issue is, once the Russians overrun the trenches over here, which they've started doing to a certain degree, there isn't any space in between them and the village of Nova itself. And then from there, by extension, you have local roads entering into areas like Lipove and Rikudub. So all those areas will, by extension, be within the range of Russian attacks and potential occupation. And so, just looking at the footage that we have to back some this up, in addition to obviously reporting from deep states, you can see over here April 9th, the Vidar unit, which is the same unit we talked about before, they're also deployed to this location by the 60th Brigade. They struck Russian soldiers in tree lines. That indication shows us that the Russians are situated in an area that is just to the east of Zelana Dolina, another village that was rather prominent like 2.5 years ago during the entire Ukrainian counteroffensive in this region, east of the Oskar River. Now it's only 2.5 kilometers away from the Russian front line. And this also could present some issues, not just in terms of elevation, because we've talked about that before, but in terms of flanking maneuvers, because if the Russians get control over this road, they will have access moving southwards towards areas like Kolodiazi, which is really important as it serves right now as a sort of a linchpin for the Ukrainians along the front line, which prevents a wide scale collapse because it really is one of the only populated areas before you reach a rear that is exposed, that contains a lot of open fields that are undefended. So it's very important to ensure that the front line remains at Koldiazi and that it doesn't really like sort of spill out southwards, because then there is much more opportunity for the Russians to exploit those gains. But let's say the Russians advance along this road over here, they could reach the trench lines built that are supposed to defend the northern flank of Liman, and they would reach areas like Stavki. So it's very important for the Ukrainians to prevent the Russians from accessing this vertical road. Now let's move on to the situation in Kursk to finish off the video. So you can see over here, this was released by the 82nd Brigade, Air Assault Brigade. They claim to have ambushed a Russian squad, and in the video, you see there were 7 Russian soldiers that were sneaking just past the road into a forested patch, and then some of them were killed by mines that were placed by the Ukrainian side. So that's pretty interesting because to us, it indicates that the Russians actually have the ability to really penetrate deeper past Guavo. And we'll see the distance right now at a distance of 4 kilometers to the southwest of Guavo. So just taking a conservative estimate, I'm not going to assume that all of the forested locations and all of the routes leading to the geolocation are under full Russian control, but I'll assume that one route is currently occupied by Russia. You can see this over here, 1.5 square kilometers of territory captured at a minimum. And you could see the geolocation as well. So 7 Russian soldiers, they were caught in the minefield on, this is from April 10th. And this is really interesting because it indicates to us that now the Russian forces have the ability to reach locations that are only a couple hundred meters away from Gornal. So the Russians are beginning to make quick movement over here after they were pinned down fighting in Guavo for like 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks. Now they've been able to expand at a faster pace because they're attacking into areas that are open, that lack trenches, that uh, even if they're not open, they're just forested areas that the Ukrainians would rather not drag out the fighting in for a long time. And as a result, at least one of their assault squads was able to reach the outskirts of Gornal. And of course, their goal over here would be to take back the final village besides Oleshnia that is under Ukrainian control in the Kursk region. And at the same time, just get rid of all these excess salients that currently serve as pockets of resistance. Very small squads are located over here, but they do still act as a thorn in Russia's back. So they would like to take them out, the Russian side, and just squeeze out any remaining Ukrainian presence in these pockets, villages, salients. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.